8 November 1943. Simpson Harbor, Rabaul, New Britain. Heat lifts off the water like breath from a furnace as blue gull wings carve into the sky. Lieutenant Commander John T. Blackburn tips VF-17 into the sun, and the Corsairs harden into a climbing line. Ahead, the harbor glitters with wakes and black dots rising off the strip. Zeros lifting in tight Vs under Lieutenant Commander Harutoshi Okamoto. The radio is short and dry. High cover. 2 o'clock. In. Throttle go forward. The nose falls. The first pass is all compression and math. The F4U dives gathers weight, and the sight settles for half a heartbeat. 650s speak in one flat roar, and the tracers walk across a canopy. A white flash, a wing lifts, a shape tumbles. No one turns to watch. Blackburn's voice cuts through the oxygen hiss. Off. Climb. Reset. The Corsairs streak through the column of rising air, pull long, and vanish into glare. Zeros keep coming stacked to protect the approaches. Disciplined, certain the old script still governs the meeting force. A level fight. Drag the American into a turnbite on the climb. The script finds nothing to hold. The Corsairs refuse every invitation. They do not bank into a dance. They fall like hammers, strike once, and are gone before a rudder can bite. In the houses under the ridge, the windows rattle from passing shock, and the harbor chops with the wake of scrambling boats. Up here it is mask, breath, and wind over metal. A second knot of defenders threads upward, angling to rake the American escorts away from the strike lanes. Blackburn flattens the formation, slides them high and left, and tips them over again. Sun on canopies, shadows growing long across the cowling, the smell of hot electrics and cordite. Another short burst, another ribline appears on a Zero's skin, then tears. Smoke blooms black and oily, and the pilot's silhouette pitches forward. Off, up, 2000. Boots press the pedals. The Corsairs are already shallow climbing through fractured cloud, opening the distance to reset energy before any turn can bite. Below the fight, Simpson Harbor is a map, pinned to a table, reefs like chalk, marks the airfield like a pencil smear. Up here, details reduce to cues you can trust. If a Zero slides up from 6 high, don't skid, don't yank, don't gift him angle. Hold the line until the dive takes you away. If a glint crosses left to right at your altitude, it is not for you. It is for the man you cover. Call it cut across, throw a line of fire where his future will be. Talk is short because nothing needs poetry. Single high. Break. Negative. Stay fast. Clear. The procedure keeps shape, even when the heart races. Breath fogs the edge of a mask. A canopy seal shrieks for a bar of time as pressure changes. A Corsair rolls level into sun, and the cockpit turns white, then blue again. Trails stitch the space they just vacated. A Zero tries to hold the vertical, wobbles at the top, falls through its own smoke, and the American wingman does not follow. He writes the pattern again: climb, slide, dive, 2 beats of trigger, extend. It looks cruel because it never lingers. It looks simple because it is practiced. It is neither. Every pass is a coin toss with flak and luck, and yet the rhythm never breaks. The harbor's noise arrives late, a distant percussion under the headset. Up close, there is only the motor, the oxygen, the click of a glove on a switch, and the thud in a chest that finally notices itself. Blackburn's tone never rises. Reform. High cover. Watch the deck. On the Japanese side, hands are tight on throttles, eyes searching the empty patch where the Americans were a moment ago, trying to force the fight back into the turn they know. The sky refuses them. The next attack will come from where the light hurts. One Corsair slides along a strip of cloud until the wingtip scrapes vapor and the cowling beads of water that blows away in silver rain. He checks fuel checks, ammo checks, the air above the sunline. The formation breathes into place, blue arcs on a pale canvas. No cheer, no tally boast. Just the next line of the method waiting to be spoken. The wind holds a high, thin note. Oxygen whispers. Nothing else speaks. In early November 1943, the skies over Rabaul were a hot metal dome where every little mistake cost fuel, time, and the lives of pilots. The Allies had just opened Bougainville. The forward airstrips were starting to drop off, and the rhythm of attacks on Simpson Harbor grew more intense each day. On paper, Rabaul was still the 11th Air Fleet's fortress. In the field, every sortie there had to be shared between the last liters of fuel and the remaining minutes of training. The aura of the Zero still clung to the memory of 2 years earlier. If the enemy was foolish enough to hold level and put itself into a turn, the Zero would close in with its familiar climb angle, drag it into a low airspeed, low speed position, and then tear it apart with close-in fire. But the rhythm out there had changed, and it had changed with a simple equation. Don't stay, don't circle, don't give your opponent a window long enough to turn his strengths into bites. The Americans knew this in a cold way when Bougainville needed a safe corridor to send in attack aircraft. Escorting was no longer a title. It was a series of maneuvers that had to be performed perfectly dozens of times in an hour of flight. VF-17's Corsairs were therefore not allowed to win beautifully. They had to win steadily. From a favorable altitude, they dived converted potential energy into speed, released 2 trigger strokes, and then stretched out of the thick air mass of flak and dangerous tails. Everything was put into the process. The position of the sun, the cloud cover that would be available after the breakaway, the altitude at which the Zero would run out of breath if it tried to catch up. When one Corsair squadron broke away from the line of sight, another was already on the sunshade ready to dive. There was no room for show, only room for rhythm. The Japanese still had a story to tell. Rabaul was home ground. The Allied lines of advance were mapped out like a training map, every cloud and sea breeze familiar to them. In theory, if they could keep their formation tight, pull the enemy into familiar planes, Zero would close the gap, force them to carry more angles than their frames could handle, and that was it. But that theory required one prerequisite: the enemy had to agree to stay. During that week, the Corsair absolutely refused to do so. Whenever Zero tried to raise its nose to pull up the angle of climb, the enemy was no longer there. When Zero swung sideways to find the bite angle at medium range, the line of fire slipped away from them like a bridge being pulled away. Rhythm was the second knife. With Rabaul, each push-up to meet an incursion was a further exploitation of the fuel tank and training margin. With Corsair, each in-out was fed by a chain of maintenance, resupply, and crew changes that could run like an assembly line. No one here was talking about changing the whole war. The cockpit crew was thinking only of the next 10 minutes. But those 10 minutes were where Bougainville either kept its rhythm or lost it. If the escort broke its rhythm, the attack planes would be pulled off the axis of attack, the slower planes exposed to flak, and the hardened Zero pairs. If the escort kept its rhythm, Rabaul would lose its ability to intercept at the right time and place, and the entire attack window would pass like an unreachable conveyor belt. Psychological pressure also split the sky. The Japanese pilots retained a layer of confidence from past campaigns. They knew, by heart, the columns of numbers, for turning radii, the angles of climb at optimum speed, the vertical pulls that could crush an undisciplined opponent. But each missed entry, each pull-up with only cold sunlight in front of them, made the story a little more worn. On the American side, it was the opposite. Fear did not disappear, it was simply framed in short radio commands. When the heart beat fast, people clung to the procedure. When the procedure was right, the breathing rate dropped. And when the breathing rate dropped, the next one was right. The strategic bet was therefore not a grand declaration, but a calculation of time. If Rabaul could still draw the escort into a circle and inflict steady losses, Bougainville would have to spend more men, more machines, and more weeks. Each week, a longer supply line, a longer line of positions to hold. If the escort cut off the fighter umbrella, with its hit-and-run rhythm, Rabaul would quickly become a tired landing zone where men took off only to be worn out. There, even a great pilot becomes an asset to be preserved rather than a blade to be stabbed. When you have to preserve, you are no longer the same threat. It all came down to a simple command, written on the blackboard: don't accept invitations to duel. Reclaim the right to choose the timing. Kill with speed. Survive with distance. The Corsair had a large hull, a wide turn angle, and its own weaknesses, but it allowed one important condition: maintaining a high enough speed margin to decide when to engage and when to disengage. In an operational window of flak, low cloud, and blinding sun, that prerogative determined who got to rewrite the rhythm of battle. At Rabaul, it passed from defender to escort. The event that one saw over Simpson Harbor in those days was therefore not a single moment of brilliance. It was evidence that ran multiple times in the same afternoon. When the Corsairs didn't stay, the Zeros failed to impose their game. When the Zeros failed to impose their game, the intercept line broke into small pieces, and all that remained was a single attempt to bite into a tail that had just passed like a water balloon. With each successful iteration, the gap between myth and reality widened a little. In terms of feeling, it was a tightrope that stretched from Kakaranj Cove offshore to the edge of the steep forest behind the runway. Below, the ships were still moving, the anti-aircraft guns were still counting, the explosions, the attack planes were still tracing their targets like a ruler. Above, the escorts had only one question: was the rhythm still correct? When the answer was yes, the Corsairs disappeared into the sun, then returned on time on course 2 shots from the gun. When the answer was no, things slipped away very quickly. People were pulled into a loop, lost altitude, flaked towards the edge of the sky. Both sides understood that there would be no drama to tell. Only the passage of time shortened or lengthened. And that week the clock's hands tilted in the direction of fear. The skies over Rabaul in early November 1943 were a pressure cage where every decision was paid for in seconds. The Zeros were truly terrifying, not because of their legends, but because they turned the enemy's wrong rhythm into a dead end. At low to medium speeds, when the engagement plane was pulled into a turn, the Zeros turned sharply, pitching their noses at the exact climbing angles they had practiced to the core. If the hunted tried to hug the tail to keep it clear, the fuselage would vibrate in an overloaded rhythm. The sight drifted as if pushed by an invisible hand, and the other Zero only had to wait another half-breath to fill the space behind. The wing. The close-range shot was quiet. A few sparks flew through the frame, the glass shattered, and the sound of wind suddenly rushed into the cockpit. What cost American pilots their planes since 1942 was not some clever trick, but human inertia. When they saw the target growing in the glass, they stayed for another half-second to fix their aim. That half-second is where Zero bit in. The Japanese's limits were revealed precisely where they were strong. That advantage was only realized when someone else shared the horizontal plane and time. If the target disappeared vertically or left the high-speed frame that Zero favored, the pull-ups ended in a wobbly top turn where the nose bobbed, the wingtips trembled, and the speed dropped long enough for someone else to cut. In. Over Rabaul, where flak formed invisible barriers, every second spent at low altitude was a second spent in the anti-aircraft gun corridor. Zero's pursuit time was therefore short. If they didn't hook the enemy on the first turn, they had to decide quickly whether to pursue or return cover to the formation. VF-17 offered a different rhythm: chain fire. No invitations to round were accepted. Higher up above the sun, the Corsairs built up power. When Blackburn called in, the nose dropped like a trapdoor, the whole fuselage, heavy and potential energy, converted to speed. The firing range was clamped short, the sights stabilized for half a breath. The 50 seconds, sprayed a compressed flame trail, not long or decorative, just long enough for the bullet marks to form a strip across the cockpit frame or the center of the fuselage. The smell of hot electricity and gunpowder streaked the nose. The background vibration of the fuselage changed tone for a moment, and the control stick was pulled toward the sun. The hard part was that no one was allowed to stay behind to make a little pretty adjustment. To miss an extra trigger stroke was to tie oneself to Zero's game. Radio discipline keeps the rhythm. No fancy words, no details. In is to enter. Off is to leave. Climb is to climb. Reset is to return to the dominant energy zone. The leader needs only 2 other prompts: flak warning and calling out the straggler position. Everything else is a matter of 2 things: dive angle and escape corridor. Right angle, the aimer stays still. Wrong angle, abandon, no pursuit, no instinct. The escape corridor must be sunny or thinly clouded, where the stalker, even close enough, will see only a dark blue mass blending into the light. The death zones of each side overlapped. If the Corsair was sucked down low and its speed dropped, the horizontal plane opened up like a canvas for Zero to spread out his cards, squeeze, change direction, pitch up. But when the Corsairs maintained their high-speed differential, they dominated the dive. The most effective move was not a straight 6 o'clock dive, but a half-angled dive from above, where the opponent had to correct course and take fire. The ideal escape was straight into the sun. The second escape was slithering through a thin bank of cloud to cut off visibility. The last thing one did was pull sideways to watch the result. The result did not need to be watched. If the target lost control, it would be revealed by smoke. If not, the next round would take care of it. On a midweek mission, when the first Zero squad broke up because of the rapid in-out, another squad climbed up from the left side of the bay, trying to build a wall in front of the attack line. VF-17 did not change positions. 2 Corsairs held the sunshade to lock them in with shadows. 2 others were positioned one notch off to break the cutting angle. The leader dropped the nose, the sight just stopped, then released two beats. The Zero's fuselage jerked a vane and then smoked. No one stopped to watch. When the other tried to follow it past the top of the loop at low-speed wingtips, shaking the wind noise, thick as cotton, and the second pair of Corsairs fell in from the flank. Same move, same call, and same silence afterward. Repetition not for convenience, but because repetition reduces risk. Sensory cues tell the pilot he's on the right side of the equation. When the sight stays in place for exactly half a breath, the chances of survival increase dramatically. When the trigger is pulled without the stick being pulled back by the effort to hold it, it's a good shot. When the light hits the windshield so hard that the eyes squint, it's a safe corridor. Conversely, any urge to stay a little longer signals a trap. The fuselage begins to vibrate in a smooth rhythm. The nose rises a small angle but feels heavier, and the wind noise changes from whistling to tearing. Just half a second longer in that state, and the Zero will bulge in the corner of the windshield. Rabaul's flak added an unforgettable factor. It blocked the low level with a steady burst of explosives and delayed any attempt to prolong the engagement. For the Americans, flak was the reason the hit-and-run tactic was not just an option but a necessity. For the Japanese, flak forced them to choose the moment to leave the tail so as not to be interrupted by their own bursts. Both sides had to count by seconds. The chain could not afford delays. What made the VF-17 approach so dangerous wasn't any particular superiority, but the way the Corsairs' parameters were put together. A more durable fuselage that could take the risk of passing through a flak trail on a breakaway. A 50 caliber firepower that was deep enough to allow two trigger strokes to create a deconstructive effect at controlled range. A dive sight that could break the flank in half while keeping the sight still. And, most importantly, the energy could be stored very quickly while climbing toward the sun. With all those pieces in place, the Zero had no chance of forcing anyone into a turn unless the opponent volunteered. During that week, the collisions connected to form a clear chain of tactical observations. Enter from the sun, maintain the high-speed differential. Shoot very short at a certain distance, no spraying. Exit straight from the sun or creeping through the clouds, no turning back. Re-enter when the flak fuel margin allows. Each link is connected by human details. The breath through the mask, the hiss of oxygen, the smell of hot electricity, gloves touching switches, eyes squinting when piercing the sunstreak. On the other side are the hands gripping the steering wheel, hoping the opponent will stay, then the feeling of losing your footing when everything drifts out of the desired plane. When rhythm became reflex, there was no question of luck. Each in-out produced the same image, a trail of black smoke, a change of wind, and a brief silence in the air as the crews lined up. Any cinematic drama was pushed aside by the demands of the job, keeping the attack planes through on time. Rabaul was the Japanese home turf, but the rhythm of the day did not belong to them. It belonged to those who could turn a chaotic battle into a series of repetitive maneuvers. This is not a fluke. This is a process that can be taught to an entire squadron. The sun beat straight into the glass like a hot knife as the 253rd Kokutai's V formation lifted off the runway. The wheels no sooner folded into their slots than the smell of burning gasoline rose under their masks. Sweat trickled down their cheeks, and a thin layer of salt coated their joysticks. Ahead, the Gulf split was bright, a swarm of black dots drifting up from the edge of the clouds. The radio calls were short and flat, clipped like the click of a penknife. Hold tight, climb in time, don't let the enemy pull you apart. In the old image, the Americans would hold level long enough for the Zeros to circle, get the angle bite. But in the convex glass, the dark green planes didn't swell slowly like docile targets. They slid past the edge of the field of vision like a shadow, getting smaller, then disappearing into the glare. The control stick shook slightly as the angle of climb approached the threshold. They were gone. The wind noise on the wingtips was thick as cotton. High above the VF-17 Corsair stood in the light stairway. Lieutenant Commander John T. Blackburn kept his voice as flat as water, breaking the command into small stones thrown evenly. Identify. To right. In. No one answered at length. Nose down, chest belts pressed, ears buzzed half a beat, speedometer slid to a memorized number. The sight stayed still, as if held by two fingers, two pulls of the trigger. The sound was not a discrete explosion, but a sharp, compressed, short burst. The smell of hot electricity and cordite pushed into the nasal cavity. No second adjustment. No look at the result. Off. The lever rose to the sun, the fuselage heavy, as if it had just passed through a layer of thick water. Climb. reset. Below the Zero pilot looked to the right wing, still seeing his teammates close in range. The old routine ran through his head like a rote recitation circle: hold the load, wait for the enemy to slide wide, nose up. But when he pressed the lever to gain angle, the target left the horizontal plane as if a switch had been turned. A dark blue streak split his vision diagonally. From top to bottom, the bullet trail clung to his side like a new row of rivets. Black smoke puffed up a pocket. The finger that had been squeezing the trigger had to release it because there was nothing left in the sight but a blank space. The radio choked in his throat, only a short breath, and inhaling deeply, the rubber smell of the mask filled his lungs. The Corsair pulled through the thin edge of the cloud. The light hit the glass, turning the cockpit milky, then dark blue. The glove touched the switch with a dry click. Check 6. Clear. The sun was where the leader had taught it to block the eyes of the follower. The lead pair left the shaft, the rear pair had climbed to the preset level. Not by chance, not by inspiration, just by distance and timing of repetition. The Japanese formation tried to close the gap between the escort and the attack. Push, pull, repetition, backs pressed into the seats until the shoulders ached. A Zero raised its nose to cut the wingtips, vibrating at a new frequency. The wind changed from whistling to tearing, like cloth rubbing against the side of a ship. At the top of the circle, the weight melted away and collapsed. Eyes darkened for half a second. When the sun was back where it was brightest, the target was gone. A line of bullets streaked past, leaving thin streaks of light. A drop of oil splashed on the edge of the windshield, and the empty feeling in the stomach like falling a step. Too high left, single low front, flak right. The fragmented sentences circled the VF-17 airwaves like periods in a textbook. A pilot tightened his stick a half-pound to get his aim centered. 2 more strokes of the trigger. The opponent's body jerked a vein. The metal panel undulated, a piece of the wing root spun like a rusted leaf. Off. The right foot kicked lightly, the nose adjusted halfway, and the plane slid into the sun where the right eye squinted. The breathing through the oxygen was as steady as a small vacuum cleaner fixed in the corner of the room. Each inhalation and exhalation marked the lengthening of the safe distance. On the Japanese side, the time pulses were unusually long. 3 seconds at the top of the lap felt like 30. Fuel was no longer a lifeless number, it was a decision to chase another shot or to fall back and hold position. Their own flak formed a carpet of explosions, blocking any attempt to hold their opponents as they stretched out of the lower level. One moment, the remnants saw their friends' black smoke trails and the veins bulging under their belts. The next, they were scanning the clouds for a backrest, to take a deep breath, to catch their breath. A Corsair ran straight through the cloud bank, its wingtips brushing against the white cotton, shedding tiny droplets that broke into silver rain. The pilot glanced down at the fuel gauge, a pencil mark in his head: 2 more turns and home. Reform. High cover. Blackburn's voice was flat. No jokes, no encouragement. The confidence came from the process, not the words. The new Zeros climbed from the harbor slope, the sun beating obliquely, creating a shadow on their wings. The lesson did not change. The Corsair banked to the memorized angle, the horizon rotated a quarter turn, then stood still in the glass frame. The firing line was diagonal to the prey's body. 2 beats. The Japanese fuselage shook as if it had been grabbed and shaken. No look. Escape. The sun swallowed the green shadow. Behind, the remaining Japanese pilot pulled the angle too far. The wingtips trembled. The wind noise thickened, his heart pounding, as if it wanted to climb out of his throat. He released the trigger because there was nothing left to lock on but a blinding white sky, then turned sideways to find the shadow of a cloud. For the first time that morning, the eye did not seek a target, it sought safety. In every cockpit, the body is a second clock. In a dive, the belt tightens so tight that the spine rattles. When pulled, blood rushes to one side, the corner of the eye is covered in ink. Every click of a switch, every hiccup of the throttle, every slight variation in the engine's tone is a signal. The right signal tells you that the procedure is keeping you above water. The wrong signal tells you that the surface is about to break like thin ice. With the Corsair, the right signal is a half-beat still sight, the right smell of cordite, the flash of flak at the edge of vision, the blinding sunlight on exit. With the Zero, the right signal used to be a fine vibration that signaled a turn. A thin whistling sound at the edge of the wing, indicating steady speed. The wrong signal now is the blinding void where the target has disappeared. The Japanese radio began to have long, nameless silences. It wasn't calm. It was nothing to say. Each call brought a difficult decision: to chase deeper meant to risk going into the explosion carpet, and to give up chasing meant to expose the flank for the next dive. The fingers that had been steady on the trigger now jerked slightly like a reflex, releasing when the shot missed by a fraction. A friendly plane's fuselage smoked the black mass rising into a column. The silence that followed was like a gasp in a mask going nowhere. On the VF-17, radio numbers were thrown like cards on a conveyor belt: ammo check, fuel status, time to bingo. One voice called out flak positions. Another counted the distance to the attack entrance. No one praised a good shot, no one described how the debris had flown. When a Corsair reported an anomaly, the pair automatically retreated a notch, allowing the next pair to take up the axis. The space created by the change of notch was covered by a slide through the clouds in a slight flick of sunlight. The chain was running, they just pushed the gears back into the groove. A moment later, when the rhythm of impact had subsided like a windless sea, each cockpit had only two things to do: check the fuselage with their eyes and hands, and scan the sky again on the divided ladder. The green indicator remained still. The temperature needle did not climb abnormally. The engine noise returned to its familiar tone. Blackburn's voice dropped three more words, short, cool, as casual as opening a warehouse door: watch the deck. From above, the bay's runway was like a thread around the wrist. Slower planes were coming into the corridor, and they were there to keep the ceiling safe. The remaining Zero pilot looked through the slit of the indicator light, saw the beam of sunlight, and turned away to avoid being blinded. His chest tightened. He suddenly felt his breathing clearly for the first time that morning, counted each time the oxygen valve opened. Thoughts retreated, thoughts chased, thoughts rose a beat higher, then stopped. The fatigue in his forearms spoke a different language than the textbooks. No need to argue to survive the next 10 minutes. Above, a Corsair checked a three-line list, written in grease pen on the edge of the board angle: short fire, get out. The order never changed. At the end of the sequence was a pause, the only sound being the whistling of oxygen and the wind on metal. In that pause, both sides waited for the same thing: the signal for the next round. When it came, the Americans said two words. The Japanese squeezed once more, and the sky stretched and contracted again to follow whoever got the move right first. The decision chain begins before the first dive, with Lieutenant Commander John T. Blackburn making the rule that matters more than any boast: do not turn with a zero. He drills it on the line and in the air, then cuts it into the radio cadence until the words become muscle memory. The method is simple in text and demanding in execution. Build altitude over the approach lanes. Hold energy. Enter only with a clear height and speed advantage. Attack across the opponent's plane from above or high quarter. Fire in a single compressed burst. Leave straight into the sun or a gauzy strip of clouds. Reform, high reset, and hand the next run to the next pair. Nothing about this is romantic. It is the conversion of air combat into steps that any disciplined pilot can reproduce on schedule. The step from trick to doctrine is short because the organization is ready to make it. Commercial planners push Corsairs into high-cover tasks precisely to break Rabaul's intercept rhythm and keep the strike package's roof intact. The morning after a hard sortie, the after-action sheet is not a souvenir. It is a stencil. Camera gun reels come off the wings, get threaded through a projector, and the room watches when the sight settles, when the trigger lifts, and when the exit starts. An instructor chalks three phrases that do not change: do not circle, shoot, short climb, now. A second hand sketches entry geometry and escape corridors against flak sectors, anchoring each line to the real bays, reefs, and cloud ladders the pilot saw yesterday. Because the pipeline behind the cockpit is thick, the risk tolerance rises. A Corsair that limps home with holes goes nose to tail with a maintenance crew that treats damage like a list of bolts, hoses, and panels. There are spares for guns, props, pumps, and cowlings. A plane that can start and hold pressure will likely fly the afternoon hop. When a pilot rotates out, another steps in, having been taught the same 5 radio words and the same 3 timing marks on the gun sight. The machine of replacements does not make anyone invulnerable. It makes a unit consistent. Consistency is what turns a tactic into a schedule, and a schedule into pressure. On the line, the standard operating procedure settles into the body as much as the brain. A lead confirms altitude, spread, and sun position, then says only what the plan allows. In, off, climb, reset. When a pilot feels his hand tempted to add a third squeeze on the trigger, he lifts off instead and watches the canopy fill with white glare, because the rule says never look back to admire the damage. A wingman keeps 6 o'clock clean, not with chatter, but with one crisp call if anything moves in the wrong place. If flak climbs into the exit, the pair knows which slice of cloud to cut and which heading keeps them out of the convoy's guns. The pattern repeats until ammunition and fuel put a number on the final pass, and even that number is planned before wheels leave the strip. The Japanese chain of decisions is narrower. Fuel ratios are not a rumor. They are the length of the scramble, the height of the first merge, and the maximum number of times a pilot can chase a silhouette into a climb before the gauge presses him back toward the field. Training hours are thin. Veteran pilots are a treasury that cannot be replenished. That treasury shapes behavior as surely as doctrine does. If the first attempt to force a level fight fails, a zero leader cannot spend 2 more dives to make pride feel better. He is the keeper of the last experienced hands in the group, and keepers do not gamble when the odds require the enemy to cooperate. Rabaul's own defenses tighten the noose. The flak rings that should make attackers pay also frame the altitude where turning fights become a liability. A zero that follows a diving Corsair too far down risks crossing the convoy's timed bursts at the worst moment. A pilot who pulls up too early to avoid those bursts becomes a stationary mark at the top of a thin energy arc. Either way, the defender is the one accepting penalties set by the geometry of a harbor under siege. The attacker, if he keeps the procedure, moves along lanes his own planners sketched the night before. Turnaround discipline is the invisible half of doctrine. On the American side, it looks like a crew chief's slap on cowling latches, a fuel hose clicking out, and the faint solvent smell of freshly cleaned guns. It looks like a squadron clerk drawing a neat line from the camera gun frame where the burst begins to the frame where the canopy shatters, then write a distance estimate next to it so the next briefing can say the number out loud. It looks like Blackburn walking past 2 pilots and saying only shorter burst then moving on. When such details are repeated across days, the method survives fatigue and weather. When they are not, the temptation to linger for a perfect sight picture blooms again and kills someone. Standardization spreads sideways. A neighboring section borrows the same radio verbs. A marine outfit rotating through borrows the same sun discipline and the same laddered altitudes. After 1 week of pressure, escort coordinators begin slotting Corsair pairs into named positions by habit: high guard, high left cutter, reset post over reef X. The words are local, the logic is universal. Once the logic is universal, individual brilliance stops being the hinge of existence. You can lose a man with 200 hours and plug in a man with 40 because the instructions are designed to be obeyed under fear, not interpreted under pride. Debrief culture hardens that shift. The room does not applaud. A pilot who broke the rule admits it with 4 words, and the conclusion is not a speech but a line on the board, erased and rewritten with his mistake corrected into it. If a camera shows a long spray that wasted ammo, the quartermaster purses his lips. That purse is the language of logistics, reminds tactics that bullets are also a supply chain. If a climb-out path brushes the top of a flak pattern, a finger taps the map, and the finger's nail is the punctuation mark. The human tone remains dry because the point is to compress emotion into behavior. The colder it sounds, the more reliable it becomes. Across the harbor, Japanese maintenance does not have the luxury of compression. A shot-up airframe can sit for days, waiting for a pump, a panel, or a gun sight lens. Ground crews stretch cannibalization farther each week. When a veteran comes back shaken, and the crew chief sees the fatigue in his hands, the calculus changes again. The pilot becomes a museum piece, not a blade to be dulled. He will still fly, but he will be told to avoid the vertical drag race with heavy Americans who refuse to stay and dance. That instruction preserves people. It concedes initiative. The contrast is not moral. It is mechanical. One side turns fear into a checklist and backs the checklist with parts and training. The other side turns experience into caution and backs caution with scarcity. In the sky, those choices appear as timing. The Americans enter when they choose and leave when they choose. The Japanese wait for a mistake that the procedure denies them. When pressure mounts, the practical effect is that the zero cannot outrun an exit, he cannot predict, cannot outclimb a pass, he cannot force, and cannot outgun a burst that arrives only when the sight is already steady. Doctrine is a sentence that can be spoken on the radio without poetry. The sentence here is 4 clauses long. Keep energy, choose time, shoot short, leave now. Every supporting function bends toward making those clauses easy to obey. The brief is shorter, so the mind is emptier under stress. The maintenance is brisk, so the airframe is trusted when yanked past comfort. The ammunition is counted, so the trigger discipline is real. The film is watched, so the memory is not a lie. The words are the same at dawn and at dusk, so the mouth does not have to find them in the heat. By the end of the week, the shift is visible even to men who do not write reports. Bomber crews see intercept waves that arrive late and disintegrate early. Destroyer captains watch the flak cadence fall on empty air because the escorts refuse to idle where the bursts are thickest. Japanese leaders whisper about fuel, then about replacements, then about how to avoid giving the Corsairs a clean angle in the next scramble. American leaders murmur fewer syllables and point at the clock. The clock is what doctrine buys when industry keeps its wound. From that moment, boom and zoom is no longer a trick. It is an order. The legend at Rabaul had been simple. Keep your opponent on the level plane, force him into a turn, pull the nose up on the right rhythm, and bite at close range. 253rd. Kokutai had lived by that formula for 2 years, knowing by heart the sweet spot of speed, pull, angle, turn radius, and the human habit of lingering for half a second to fix your aim. On home turf, where sea clouds and flak carpets were known, like the back of one's hand, the belief grew stronger. If you just keep your formation tight, get the right altitude, the intercept would tear the escort roof apart. But in the first week of November, 1,943 VF-17 brought something that threw that formula out of hand. They turned the battle into a business rhythm, where the Americans arrived at the right time, left at the right time, and never agreed to stay. The entries and exits overlapped like saw teeth. From above the sun, the Corsair swooped down, cutting diagonally across the engagement plane, released 2 short trigger strokes, and then escaped into the light or thin cloud. No head-down chase, no nose-up loop, no flat surface to hang on to. When 253rd, Kokutai tried to loop. The crest became a weak spot, wingtips quivering the wind, noise thick as cotton, a moment of silence before the weight collapsed, and there another F4U jabbed in from the flank. Repetition killed the myth more effectively than any single kill. Same angle of entry, same trigger stroke, same exit, and each time the chance of pulling the enemy into a loop was a little shorter. On the Japanese frequency, the calls to go circling faded, replaced by flak below target lost break formation. As the pilots tried to keep their men under the bomber canopy, they had to accept a new truth: if the enemy did not stay, no circling could be built. The loss of advantage was not loud. It seeped into the hesitation on the trigger, into the sideways glance when the sun hit the windshield, when the F4U broke away into the fuel calculations that forced the pursuit to be abandoned before the flak turned low level into a scythe. In the day's post-flight operational notes, a dry line began to repeat, "Do not pursue the Corsair deep after the dive." On the American side, the rhythm was as tight as a string. Lieutenant Commander John T. Blackburn kept the same 4 short commands, and when they were repeated enough times, they became a collective habit. Keep energy. Choose the moment. Shoot short. Leave immediately. High cover rotated with the sun like a gear. The in-out pair took turns keeping the roof for the strike lane. The camera gun returned film frames at the right distance, and at the right time, the trigger was released. There was no longer combat in the sense of one-on-one, there was only execution in the sense of an assembly line. When the assembly line ran smoothly, the sky no longer had room for a backflip. By piloting, the one who wanted to be good still had to wait for the opponent to make a mistake, and the opponent would not allow it. The Japanese were forced to change their behavior within the same time window. Formation was compressed to reduce the risk of being flanked. Abandonment orders were issued earlier once the Corsair had pulled into the sun. Climb angles were tempered to avoid the empty apex of the loop. Experienced pilots were conserved as scarce assets, meaning they were no longer allowed to push the encounter to the point where they had once made their mark. This avoidance was not cowardice, it was mathematics. Every minute of fuel, every undamaged frame, every pair of arms with 1,000 hours of flight time was worth more than an attempt to force a loop in an environment where the enemy would not stay. When preservation became the priority, power was no longer a threat, it was a burden to be protected. The objective indicators were one after another. Intercepts were coming later and dissolving earlier. The escort space for strikes was as long as a rented corridor. Japanese frequencies were more likely to call abandon than enter. Pure turn-fight situations were becoming rarer. Corsair escapes were rarely chased down to the lower levels where flak was thickest. Even in the rare favorable moments, when a Zero caught the tail at medium range, the risk of another F4U swooping down from the flank made the trigger squeeze half a beat. The myth needed confidence to live. That confidence was being loosened by long lulls in the air and by black smoke lines rising where there shouldn't be one. The breaking point, then, was not a loud bang. It was a steady no to every invitation to a round. Each Corsair refusal lost a piece of the 253rd Kokutai formula. Each boom and zoom success forced the Japanese habit to retreat from its once effective position. And as a group began to wait for the next dive instead of the next loop, the mental priority shifted from attack to survival. The Americans needed no more than a few syllables. The Japanese began to speak less without any instructions they could trust. In that space, the defense's punchline sounded like a bullet point, no more climbing over them at this window. It wasn't a public confession. It was the closed language of the debrief room where the person signing the minutes understood that tomorrow they wouldn't be told to pull more, but to dodge around. A small change on the chalkboard led to a big change in the sky. Intercepts would stay closer to the roof, abandon pursuit earlier, and hope for a rare misstep from their opponents, instead of demanding that they get into the same frame. From that day on, Zero was no longer the hunter in Rabaul, he was the shadow that had to avoid the next dive. In the days immediately following the early November collisions, the escort canopy on Rabaul suddenly settled like a bolted-on tin roof. Japanese intercepts still flew, but later and earlier. The attack corridors across Simpson Harbor were rarely blocked at the exact moment they had once expected. On the tarmac, the Corsair's camera gun film was pulled through the projector, and the room saw the same image over and over again. The sight held still for half a breath, 2 short trigger strokes, the escape into the sunlight. On the board, 3 lines of command were written, large and straightforward: conserve energy, choose your timing, fire short, leave now. No one argued. People just nodded, seeing themselves in the frames. Another week passed, and the Corsair's in-and-out rhythm became so routine that it could be timed. The high cover pairs rotated with the sun on a schedule, so that when one pair was off, the other pair was in, never leaving the roof open more than a crack. The radio in the US sounded like a ticking clock: in, off, climb, reset. Sortie reports recorded the frequency of those 4 words growing thick and steady, while the into the circle orders became less frequent because no one needed a double spin at low altitude anymore. In the sky, the change was visible. The strike's escort gap grew longer. The black smoke trails of downed intercepts no longer fit into the entrance as before. The Japanese side gathered the remnants more tightly, their formations compressed and prioritized, keeping the bombers' shelter and their escape routes. The order to abandon the chase was given earlier as soon as the Corsairs had pulled into the sun. On the rare occasions when they tried to climb the top of the loop to cut the wingtips, trembled, and the heavy wind noise made the commander understand that the top was empty of energy and opportunity. Fuel was being worn away quickly. Spare parts were slow to arrive. Each fuselage was an asset to be kept. A seasoned pilot was a vital asset that could not be honed by vertical gambling. When the priority of preservation overcame the habit of hunting the intercept, posture itself changed its meaning. The psychology of both sides also shifted. The Americans were still afraid, but the fear was wrapped up in a checklist for each entry-exit. When the checklist ran correctly, breathing slowed, the hand on the trigger trembled less because it knew it wouldn't pull a third time. The Japanese were still proud, but their pride was replaced by calculation, where each extra beat of pursuit meant stepping into the flak carpet and consuming something more precious than victory flight time and a pair of healthy hands. The power of the Zero thus turned from a threat into a burden to be protected, and any burden slowed a good entry. Theorizing went on without slogans. A neighboring squadron borrowed its verb radio and altitude scale. A friendly unit borrowed its escape corridor through the same cloud bank. The same rule sheet appeared in many briefing rooms. From then on, the method no longer depended on the hunches of a few experienced pilots. It was taught to the novice in 4 short lines and a 2-minute film reel. At the same time, the Japanese added chilling notes to the debrief: don't chase Corsairs deep after a dive, refrain from pitching up when there was no energy difference, avoid pulling down your own flak. The change in language was the surest sign that the skies had changed. The remaining questions are for the audience. not the command board. If this SOP had appeared a few months earlier, would Zero's aura have collapsed right at Rabaul before they had time to adapt? Would Zero still be better in a dagger fight, where the opponent never opens the dagger? And in this window, what matters more is the feature curve, or the process discipline, that forces all actions into rhythm. When the rhythm of that week ended, what remained was not a single feat, but a habit. Looking up from Bougainville, the dark blue convoy looked like a conveyor belt turning in time, pushing strike packets through a once impregnable fortress. Looking out from Rabaul, the sky no longer waited for a foolish opponent to open its circle. It waited for a dive to arrive at the appointed moment. After Rabaul, the sky doesn't wait for another beautiful turn, it waits for the next timely entry.